Starmer has reset, Barnier has resigned, and Assad has fallen. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
Just that's all. Bigoted women.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies, not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast, and joining me this week is the marvellous, the wonderful Joe Phillips. No Jim Hancock this week. Jim is off, I'm not sure, celebrating Colleen Rooney's runner-up position in I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, given the fact that Wayne Rooney, of course, is Plymouth Argyle's manager, Jim's first love, Argyle. So it's just you and I, Joe, and we're going to talk about Keir Starmer's reset last week, and then we're going to turn our attention to international affairs. The French government, of course, vote of no confidence, which we briefly spoke about last week, and that vote of confidence was lost. So Macron, after he's celebrated the reopening of Notre Dame, will be looking for a new prime minister. And then we're going to talk about Syria, which thankfully Joe Phillips knows lots about, because despite listening to literally hours and hours of podcasts and reading all of the broadsheets over the weekend, I'm still trying to get my head around what is a very, very complex and still, I suspect, dangerous situation. But let's start at home, and let's start with Keir Starmer and that reset at Pinewood Studios, no less, where, of course, as Keir Starmer referenced, James Bond has made movies. He made that quip, didn't he? Well, if Kemi Badenoch can say she's working class because she worked in McDonald's for a couple of days, that I can say that I'm James Bond. He may have reminded himself or reflected the fact that the Carry On movies used to be made at Pinewood Studios as well, but probably not the analogy he was looking for. Joe, a very wide-ranging speech. What did you make of it?
Word salad, unfortunately. I think it was and has been pretty broadly, commentators have gone, well, what was he trying to say? And you know, Frank, that I spent a lot of my life trying to persuade people to speak human and to use plain English. So we've gone from, reset to milestones, we've gone milestones to millstones, possibly pledges, promises, and none of it made any particular sense. And you sort of wonder why he did it, because even normally sympathetic journalists and commentators, as I say, were slightly bemused and perplexed by it. And you know what he's trying to do, which is to say, we know you need to feel better off. And I mean, this is the lesson really for the Democrats in America, that you can look at all the figures in the world, but the reality is, you go to the shops, you don't care about GDP, you don't care about, growth and bond markets and stuff like that. You just know it now costs you more than it did a couple of weeks ago to do the family shopping. And so I think he's sort of trying to get that message across. But I don't know who's writing his speeches, Frank. Obviously, if we'd got Jim in History Corner, he could probably take us back to one of Pitt the Younger's famous speeches. But it's just, he's not a good performer. And actually, sometimes you wonder, why did you even bother? What was the point of it? I don't think it's done anything. And also, he's compounded the bemusement by taking this side swipe at the civil service, which dear Pat McFadden has been trying to say, no, that's not what he meant, that's not what he meant. But of course, that comes after years of Michael Gove and Suella Braverman and various Tory ministers basically slagging off the civil service, so their morale is pretty low. You don't need that from Keir Starmer. So I think it was a bugger's muddle, frankly.
I think that the reason he did it was people kept saying he needs to tell us what his plan is. And the media have been after him and saying you're spending too much time abroad and you're not talking enough to us. And instead of resisting the pressure, he's basically fallen for it and given a speech that I agree with you was a little bit all over the place. It wasn't focused enough. I suppose he's also spooked a little at Reform's increase in terms of support in the polls, because one poll last week actually showed Reform ahead of Labour. And the point that you make, Joe, how do you start to deal with populists? Because across Europe and indeed in America, we're finding that, centre-left parties struggle massively to do that. So he's trying to find a way through that hell melee, I suppose. And I guess the other thing, to be fair to him, is that he's trying to say to British people, we're not like the last lot where you're going to get boosterism, or you're going to get a government that comes in and crashes the economy, or you're going to get all of these promises that can't be delivered. We're just going to get on and deliver. To which I would say a much better presentation would have been the press conference in Downing Street, 5 minutes. We're not getting involved in laying out a whole load of things that people aren't really listening to, aren't really interested in, and aren't allowing us to crack on and do what we wish to do, which is deliver. So any questions, let's go. And then go back into number 10. And then you look as though you're rolling your sleeves up, very workmanlike, and you're cracking on. I think he's left himself a number of hostages to fortune in the same way as Sunak did a couple of years ago. If you remember, he took, didn't he, to the stage to say, right, I'm going to set these targets, judge me by these. And then obviously some of them were easily met, like the inflation target. Others he never got near, like stop the boats. So that's why people are saying he set these milestones, but actually they could become millstones. Ultimately, I suspect that the people that he really needs to be talking to, i.e. the electorate, are not even aware of the fact that the speech happened. Not many, but many of them will be. And then, as you say, he's managed to piss off the civil service. Now, I wonder whether that was at one level deliberate, because you will have heard this, Joe. A number of Labour MPs and ministers are saying Dominic Cummings was right. And there is a feeling that there is a melee within the civil service, that they are managing decline, and not just at that senior level. So, very personal experiences. HMRC, the passport office have had difficulties in recent times. Try and get a driving test or driving license at the moment. All of those things. And then civil service unions saying, well, why can't we work from home, 8 days a week? So I think that he's made a point that perhaps, and a speech that perhaps would have been better as an internal team away day presentation, rather than something at Pinewood Studios, which was supposed to be telling us as the electorate, this is my plan, because I still don't think we know what his plan is.
No, exactly. And I'm sure he does. And I'm sure, in the privacy of a room with Morgan McSweeney and Pat McFadden and Angela Rayner and whoever, he can probably articulate it. But people don't want a plan. They actually need to see it and feel it. And what he doesn't seem to be able to do is to point to something tangible. I mean, here is an example, and okay, hindsight is a wonderful thing, as we all know, but we've talked often on this podcast about what an absolute balls up it was to announce the winter fuel allowance cut with no warning, and allowing weeks and weeks of very bad headlines and very bad press. If at that time you'd said, right, we're going to use that money to restart Sure Start, which every single person in the country, apart from the Tories, thought was an absolutely brilliant idea, and it changed lives, and it changed them really quickly. And the impact that Sure Start had on health, education, National Health Service, judiciary, kids not getting into crime, and the support network that it gave to struggling families was huge and tangible. Now, if they had thought about that and done that, we're going to take this from wealthy pensioners, we're going to give it to struggling families. By now, 4 months on, 3-4 months on, we would actually see mums and dads going to these Sure Start centres, and life would be improving, and you would have people talking the talk. What he doesn't have, and this is always the problem for political parties in election campaigns and outside of them, you need other people to be your advocates. You need the small business owner, the person on the housing waiting list, the person waiting for a replacement knee, etc., etc. You need them to say, no, it is actually getting better. I can feel it's getting better. I can see it's getting better. Look what they've done. And nobody that you talk to can say that at the moment. And I think you're absolutely right, Frank. I mean, why go to Pinewood Studios? What a waste of time. What a waste of effort. What was the point? You just hold yourself up to, hostage to fortune. You could have done it in Downing Street, or better still, you could have said nothing. And the civil service thing, yes, I think there is a truth, and certainly you and I both know that within certain sectors of local government, it is the same, that there is an attitude which is, well, I don't need to make a decision now. I'll write a report, I'll send an email, copy it into 3,000 other people. Oh my goodness me, there's another day gone. And I do think this idea of bringing in particularly sort of tech savvy people on a sort of a placement is a really good idea. I did an event a couple of years ago with David Cleaveley from Cambridge, who's one of the great sort of innovators and entrepreneurs in the science and tech sector. And he'd set up this brilliant thing so that civil servants could come and work within that scientific data, geeky sector. So they would go back with new skills, and they would then become the mentors for their people. So I can sort of understand why they want to do that, but it just looks like, oh, we've been down this path before. You don't know what to do. You think the civil service is rubbish. You're going to bring in some tech people who are going to go in and shake it up. And, we only have to look over to Elon Musk and his buddies and see what hell they're wreaking in America. And people will understandably think, oh, and I think also, 14 years of the Tories with a minister changing every Monday, it must have been hell working in housing or local government. And, for people who haven't read it, Rory Stewart's book about his life as a minister is one of the best descriptions of the frustrations as a minister who really wants to make change, what you're up against. And what you're up against all the time is partly our political system and the churn of ministers and prime ministers as we've had. But it is also that, no, I can't do it. Yeah. Because you don't look at
that's the point, Joe, isn't it? I think that, had he made that statement to the civil service, to those senior people, and he's got a new head of civil service in now, so what a great opportunity to say it. Look, we know you've had a decade and a half of almost for the entirety almost chaos. Both the coalition, to be fair to them, whether you agree with what they did or not, at least did have a plan, stuck to it, and there was a semblance of mature governance there. But beyond that, since Brexit, what an absolute shit show it's been. So demonstrate some understanding, but then say, we're looking to create a new deal here between us so that we can start to get some of these big priorities through. I think the other missed opportunity for him, if he was going to take to the stage, was to go through that list of things the government have actually done, which we've discussed here before. Despite the fact of only being in power for 5 months, they have got through an awful lot of stuff. They cleared some backlogs. They've sorted the doctors' strike, junior doctors' strike out. Okay, people say there should have been reforms attached to the train drivers' strike, but nevertheless, it's gone away. People out there probably don't care whether there's reforms or not, won't even know there's a conversation happening about that. Lots of other things as well. Angela Rayner and her team have been getting on with. More devolution promised and starting to be delivered. Changes in the education system. Some things that Bridget Phillipson has already delivered. If he'd have taken to the stage and said, OK, 5 months, it's been really tough. You know all the problems we inherited. Not going to talk about that again. But look at what we've done. That would have been, there'd have been a purpose to that.
Yeah.
But as you say, Joe, I think we were all left a little bit scratching our heads and wondering quite why he'd done what he'd done. And of course, the other thing that I always wonder about with these things, why take the shadow cabinet with you? Oh, it's not the shadow cabinet anymore, of course, sorry. The cabinet, maybe, but he took the shadow cabinet. He took the cabinet with him as well. You know, so it's like, well, again, you're supposed to be out there delivering. Why have you got all your team sat around you listening to a speech? But surely they know what you want to do anyway. So why are they there?
And none of them had any input. And you could have done that at Westminster rather than schlep all the way to Pinewood. I just think it was, you know, and we have talked previously, and I know if he was here, Jim would agree as well. We talked about comms. Well, we thought we'd said goodbye to this sort of nonsense when James Lyons came in to take over. Who is, you know, by and large well respected and knows what he's doing, and he's been around the, you know, the Fleet Street lobby block for a long time. So you sort of think this is a mistake, and you're absolutely right. You know, if you're going to make a speech to people, you need to do it. So like, this is what we've done. I know you think it's rubbish, but look at what we've done. You know, that immediately takes your critics head on.
Well, there's a difference, and then it's not even seen as a reset, is it? Yeah. What it's seen as is Starmer's telling us what he's achieved in a short period of time. And okay, it may not be the major stuff, but of course, nobody's expecting major stuff to have been delivered within the first 6 months of a government. So just the fact of laying out some of the achievements, I think, would have been useful, including, by the way, albeit small, but a drop in immigration. You know, more people sent back home because asylum claims are being processed quicker. And even that was mentioned, but it was skated over so quickly that nobody would have noticed. Let me go back to one of the points as to why I think he's been a little bit frit into doing this presentation though. And it is reform, and it's your old mate Nigel Farage, who's had a terrific week, hasn't he? Because he won the Newcomer of the Year at the Spectator Awards. Spectator, for those listeners who don't know, I'm sure most will, but a very, very well established, probably the leading right-wing magazine, which is published on a weekly basis, is now edited by Michael Gove. He then appeared on Question Time, and although he did get ravaged somewhat by Alistair Campbell over Brexit, he didn't have a bad night. And then, of course, he had Joe Phillips on his programme on Wednesday. So he's had a great week, as Nigel Farage. He had a great week.
He's also had Tim Montgomery join Reform and Suella Braverman's husband.
And the other one last week, Andrea Jenkins. Joined Reform, yeah. So Reform, listen, this is a worry for the Conservatives as well. Reform are on the rise, Jim. And I'm not quite sure anybody yet has been able to find a way of handling Farage and co.
No, I think Reform is, you know, it's the Grinch that's going to go on after Christmas. I think without Nigel Farage, Reform would not be so powerful. You know, he's a very good communicator. He's an extremely effective campaigner. And of course, he's got an absolutely unbridled platform with his own programme 3 nights a week on GB News. And as you say, I think you mentioned it last week, what was that, his 38th appearance on Question Time, compared with Ed Davey, who doesn't even get, you know, anywhere near it, or previous leaders of the Liberal Democrats. So if you took Nigel Farage out of the equation, Reform wouldn't have the same traction, I don't think. But he's box office, you know, that's fair enough. And I think, you know, I keep thinking back to, you know, the SDP, which was going to be the great hope, you know, David Owen, Shirley Williams, all of those fantastic by-election victories. And then it fizzled. And then, after years and years of turmoil with the Liberals and the Liberal Democrats and whether they should be called salads or slids or whatever, it ended up as the Liberal Democrats. And new parties come and go, as Macron, who we'll be talking about in a bit, knows. You start a new party and something comes up. The difference this time is that Reform look as though they have got in their new chairman or chief executive, whatever he is, somebody who's going to organise and professionalise it. And I know from years of working with the Liberal Democrats, if you've got a good organisation on the ground, then you can do an awful lot. You can build a campaign, you can build support. They will probably win quite a lot of seats in May in the local elections, and they will probably take them from Labour and the Conservatives. But they haven't got any policies. They've got an awful lot of rhetoric. They haven't got any policies. If they take council seats, in a way, that's something. This is going to sound a bit bonkers, but actually, it's quite good because you put them in some position of power and you see that they can't do anything. We had them before when they were UKIP and before that, whatever they were, on councils around here in the southeast. And they were an absolute disaster, because they didn't deal with the boring stuff that people need, like, rubbish collections and things like that. They've just got one thing, which is about immigration, and they blame everything on that, but they've got no solutions. So, as Reform becomes more successful, therefore it will be held up to greater scrutiny and people might see through them, which for Keir Starmer is a good thing because it might mean the bubble bursts before the next election. Mm-hmm. But, I think your more serious point is that the rise of populism is something that is so terrifying across Europe. It's slightly been nipped in the bud, at least temporarily, in Romania. But we can see it in France, we can see it in Germany, we've seen it in Italy, Turkey, Hungary, right across the
and with
world.
the different electoral system, Jo, we'd
Absolutely.
have seen it here more so, wouldn't we? The fact that they got 4 million votes, which translates only into 5 seats.
Yeah.
And so I think that, and Elon Musk, let's face it, if he's serious about giving £100 million to Farage and Reform, then that's serious wedge. That's more money than the Tories and Labour will be able to raise between them. So I think, I'm not so sure either about the analogy, the point you make about the councils, because again, I wonder how much people listen anymore to what's happening. And of course, what I would do as a Reform councillor, to be honest, is I blame the government. And what Farage is great at doing, and this is the populist line, isn't it? It is always somebody else's fault.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, I'm afraid to say that in UK PLC at the moment, it is somebody else's fault. It is a fantastic line to face because a lot of people think it's somebody else's fault rather than looking at themselves and thinking, well, actually, maybe I have to do something about this. So I am seriously concerned about Reform. I think that the media don't scrutinise them as much as they ought to now, and that's because they are a parliamentary party. And so can you imagine a minister, or indeed a shadow minister, or even a backbench MP from the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, or the Conservative Party, who've been jailed for booting his wife?
Mm.
Can you imagine the furore if that person continued to serve as an MP? And yet here we are, and we've had this controversy, and Tice just comes on and says, oh, it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Right, Louise Haigh, for trying to blag a new mobile phone, allegedly, has to resign a cabinet position. Yeah. So this idea that Reform could be the next government, but equally don't get the same scrutiny from Beth Rigby and from Laura Koonsberg and all the rest of the media gang, I think that is an absolute disgrace. Now, what Starmer, Badenoch and co can't do is cry foul in that situation, because it just looks as though they're whinging. As a communications person, Jo, very difficult, isn't it, to handle this stuff? And I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer.
No, and I think you're right. They do need to be scrutinised far more. I mean, and that person who you refer to, the chap who was prosecuted and charged with assault, I think he went to prison actually. You know, he should never have been selected as a candidate. Never mind being allowed to serve. You know, where was their selection process? Where was their vetting process? I mean, as you say, if it had been another party, there would have been absolute uproar. And I think, you know, the problem is, but of course, people are joining reform like they're giving away free money because it's new and it's interesting and they, you know, they sound different to the last lot. They are not a particularly democratic organisation as other political parties are. Now, you know, you and I we may take issue with the way the Conservative Party members have been allowed to choose our last 2 or 3 prime ministers, but at least that's democratic. You know, the Labour Party, 1 member, 1 vote. The Liberal Democrats, you know, torturous conferences over policy, but it is democratic. Now, as far as I can see, reform is not like that. They will do what they want. It's run much more like a franchise business, even though they are obviously a political party. And I do think the underlying trend is that people are not listening, they're not looking, they're not asking questions. They're just going, yeah, that's okay, I can really relate to that bloke. And they're not stopping to think about what that bloke, because they are mainly blokes, is saying. And I think one of the problems that, you know, and I think it is across the world, including America and most of Europe, is that people like us and our loyal band of listeners who are probably, you know, centre left. We're certainly not to the right. We're broadly pro-European, centre left, or a little bit to the left. I think it has been very hard for us to articulate what we believe in, because a lot of it is a bit Goldilocks-y. And unless you have somebody who is, you know, like Tony Blair was, comes in, says, right, this is what I'm going to do, I'm going to change the country, and wow, goes through it at a different time in 1997, I think it's really hard to say, well, you know, we just think our way is a better way because it makes common sense. And that's, of course, when you lay yourself wide open to all the barbs and snidey remarks about avocado eating, tofu drinking, whatnot, and, you know, North London lawyers and all the rest of it. And I think that's the problem, that, you know, the people in the centre who want to be fair and tolerant and decent, but also expect, you know, not a free ride for the NHS or whatever it is, we haven't articulated our position enough, and we're not tough enough on the newcomers, you know, like the reform people.
And it's
I
whether
think,
or not we've got the charismatic character to do it. Because the point that
exactly.
you made at the outset of this podcast, Joe, Keir Starmer ain't that. You know, whatever else Keir is, and we were saying he's the man for the times because we need a grown-up in the room. We need someone who's going to take this managerial approach to government and just relentlessly deliver. But unfortunately, I wonder whether we're in a new age where, because of media, because of social media, you do need somebody who can actually get up almost on a daily basis, like a Donald Trump, just take to Twitter and tweet absolute nonsense. But you grab the headlines, you set the agenda, you set the tone for the news for the day. And this idea that we can have grown-ups in the room just delivering, the only hope I have is that in 3-4 years' time, people are feeling better off, cost of living is better, people's transport services have improved, there's more police on the streets, the NHS waiting lists are down. Then, of course, he's got something to say at Pinewood Studios. But there's a big task ahead for them. I suspect that unless he delivers at least some of those things within those first 4 or 5 years, he ain't going to get the 10 years that he thought he might because of that big majority, because voters are so transient now. So, to say I'm concerned about reform, I'd be even more concerned if I was a Conservative, because I think that he's having their lunch, isn't he? Reform are having their lunch. Farage is just, as you say, Tim Montgomery. I'm really surprised, actually, by Tim Montgomery, because I've
So
always
nice.
thought he was a reasonable Conservative. In fact, I'd have placed him almost on the One Nation wing of their party. So that was a surprise. Not surprised by Jenkins. I'm not surprised if Suella Braverman ends up there. You've been predicting that for since we started the podcast.
Yeah, I know, but I don't think our podcast predictions are ever going to go down in history as what mind you, it still might be right. Priti Patel and Mel Strides could still become leader of the Conservative Party, which is yours and Jim's pick.
Well, Badenoch might end up joining Reform as well. Listen, again, I'll go back to that Spectator Party on Wednesday, which was fascinating. We have a bit more time to discuss it. I would talk about just the seating arrangements, Wes Streeton being invited by Paul Marshall to sit next to him. Bizarre. Anyway, the other thing that was apparently said was a Conservative shadow minister was asked afterwards, do you think after tonight, because Farage got to the stage after winning this award and said we're going to be forming the next government, nobody laughed. It would have been the reaction even a year ago. This Tory guy was asked, do you think there's a 10% chance now of you being in a Reform cabinet? And he said, I think the percentage is even higher than that. Much higher than that, sorry. Yeah. So yes, Reform, I think we need to keep far more of an eye on, take far more seriously, and hopefully at some point somebody within the Number 10 operation will start to get this communication strategy right, because despite many resets and speeches and various things that have happened in recent months, you and I, Joe, were not convinced.
No, and I think, we know Keir Starmer is not charismatic. He's not a brilliant orator. So actually, don't put him out there. Let him do the set piece things where he's got to do it, PMQs and the international stages and those sort of things. But otherwise, don't create opportunities where he just sounds worse. And find other people, use other people, and I think it goes back to what you were saying a few minutes ago, Frank. If you have other people who are advocating for you, they don't have to be within government. But you do need to have people from business or from the health service or from the armed forces or from education or from the judiciary. I mean, I can't remember what her position is, but she was the former inspector of constabulary. And she said, no, what they're doing about policing is really, really good. And the way that it's been covered and sneered at as Bobby's on the beat is not the point. And it doesn't matter if you're putting things back to how they were, it is improving things.
So have her on the stage at Pinewood.
Yeah.
Have people like that up there.
Exactly. Don't leave it all to Keir Starmer, because the other thing, and I think this is the really worrying thing, as time goes on, new MPs, they're going to get more and more disgruntled constituents saying, well, we voted for you because you're not the last lot, you haven't delivered, la, 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 la. They will get fed up. There will be rumblings of discontent on the backbenches. And I suspect that there might be a few Tories who decide to leave in the new year. I mean, that's been rumbling for a while, partly because of the new rules coming in on second jobs, but also because I think if they think, oh, blimey, we're consigned to the wilderness with Kemi Badenoch, or we can jump and join Reform, or we could go and get a highly paid job in the private sector, if there are indeed anyone who will employ former Tory MPs. So we might have a slew of by-elections next year, as early as the spring.
Yeah.
Which could be quite a warning shot to Keir Starmer. He just needs to focus on doing the job. He doesn't need to tell us he's doing the job. He just needs to do it.
Well, let's see if he takes that advice, Joe. I know he's a keen listener to our podcast.
Well, if he was, he wouldn't be in such a mess, would he?
I'll tell you. Yeah, well, we do. We meet Labour MPs regularly, and we do relay these messages to them. And I think some of them are as frustrated as we are. Some of them will say, though, and have said to me, in fairness, now, sort of ended the first part of our discussion on this, that, we want it both ways. We want them to be out there communicating. We want them to be getting on with the job. And as I say, I think there was some pressure from whether it be the media, whether it be from backbench MPs, for him to do something. I just don't think he chose the right thing to do. But there you go. Right, in the second part of our programme, we will be turning our attention to international affairs. We thought we would be talking about a Romanian election, but that has been cancelled due to a judicial challenge. So we don't have to go there this week, but something I'm sure we'll come back to. We will, however, be talking about Syria and France. So stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics podcast. This week it's me, Frank McKenna, and Joe Phillips. And we talked domestic politics in the first part of our programme today. Now we're going to turn our attention to international affairs, and what a momentous week it has been. Syria, which has been under the regime of the Assads for over 50 years. Well, his regime has fallen. I think it's been welcomed by most sane-thinking people. It happened very quickly. These rebels have taken Damascus within a week of the fighting, although civil war has been raging, I think, in that part of the world for many, many years now. Fortunately, because this is such a complex situation that even having listened to so many podcasts and read so many column inches, I still finding it difficult to get my head around all of those complexities. Joe, you spent a lot of time in Syria and you are our expert on this issue. So well, tell us what's happened.
I'm an expert out of two people. So
you certainly, yeah, you're more of an expert than I am, that's for sure.
So, yes, I was a director of the British Syrian Society, and I went out to Syria in the early 2000s and completely and utterly fell in love with it, and was out there working and organising events and conferences and whatnot, and completely and utterly, along with my fellow directors, believed that Assad was a reformer, that he was not like his father, who was a murderous dictator, that, you know, because Bashar al-Assad had spent most of his life working in England, he was married to an English woman, Syrian born but educated in England, that he actually genuinely wanted to reform. And we were incredibly optimistic that, you know, big companies and businesses were willing and ready to invest to see the country lift itself up again after years of sanctions and boycotts. And when people said, oh, well, you know, what's going on in the rest of the world? What about Syria? We all said, no, Syria is different. Syria is going to be a good democratic country. And it turned out not to be so. And as we know, you know, what erupted in 2011 and has then been followed with the most appalling brutality. Hundreds and thousands of people dead, displaced, 3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, and we'll come on to Turkey in a minute, but also the people who have been disappeared. And we've seen pictures on the news over the weekend of people being released from these absolutely horrific prisons. The people being released from these prisons, Frank, are not just men, they are women and children. And the brutality and the greed and the corruption of Assad's regime is only just being realised, I think. So I think all the people I've spoken to over the weekend and what my own feeling is, huge optimism, but huge apprehension. Because although the rebels are making the right noises and have apparently been going around and talking to people and saying that you're perfectly safe and they don't want to attack the institutions, they understand the importance of civil society and civic institutions. There is no guarantee that that will be the case in the weeks and months ahead. So I think everybody is watching with a mixture of relief and apprehension as to what happens next. This is a fork in the road for Syria, for sure. And it is a hugely important place historically, culturally, geographically. Geographically, that's why Russia had a naval base at Tartus. And I think what's interesting is that the fall of Assad has exposed the weakness in his backers, namely Iran and Russia. Now, he and his family have apparently been granted asylum in Moscow. Well, they're going to find a slight change in their living standards over there, I would imagine, on a cold December day in Moscow compared to all the Ferraris and Lamborghinis that you could see in the palace. So I think, it has shaken everybody, because I don't think anybody saw it coming, and they certainly didn't see it coming so quickly. What happens next will happen, I think, quite quickly. Now, Israel has been making the right noises, but at the same time has moved in further to the bit that it occupies of the Golan Heights, which,
because, just to explain, Syria is sheep by jowl, isn't it?
Yes,
Israel?
exactly. Now, had Netanyahu done this before the fall of Assad, it would have been seen as extremely provocative. Now he can say, oh, this is, protecting Israel against. I've been to the Golan Heights. It is one of the most depressing places in the world, because on the Israeli side, it's all lush and fertile. And on the other side, it's, covered in landmines, and people have to shout across the gorge to their own families. It's ghastly. And of course, there's been a lot of damage to the infrastructure of Syria, which will require an awful lot of money. And the group that has taken over are at the moment a prescribed terrorist organisation in this country and around the world. Now, Pat McFadden, I thought, was very sensible and very guarded when asked about this morning, that will the government look at it? And he said, yes, we will look at it, but we can't make a decision, because you can't just go, oh, that's fine. Oh, yeah, they seem to be nice guys. We're not going to prescribe them anymore, because we don't know. And I think that's the truth of it, is that we don't know. But one thing is for sure, Iran and Russia are completely weakened. Israel will be quite worried. Jordan, as ever, is stuck in the middle of sort of, a very tiny oasis of relative stability in the Middle East. But the key player in a lot of this is Turkey, who now have an enormous amount of leverage, not least because of the Kurds in Syria, but also because of the number of Syrian refugees who flooded into Turkey. And Turkey's role in this as the sort of the broker between, if you like, the Middle East and Europe will be hugely significant. Trump has said, it's not our war, we're not going to get involved, turn away, walk away, nothing to see here. Well, that's fine. American forces are in Syria, not very many of them, but there are a few. And the US did bomb some ISIS sites overnight or over the weekend. I think it's really important, just to give it some context, that if you remember, Obama, when he was in the White House, said, if Assad uses chemical weapons, that is a red line crossed. Yeah. Well, Assad did do that. That red line was crossed. The Americans did nothing. We had a vote in Parliament. David Cameron lost the vote because he wanted to take military intervention, and that was largely because of the cock up in Libya. And so that red line was crossed.
And also a glorious moment, another one for Ed Miliband.
Yeah, exactly.
Who, of course, didn't want any involvement in anything in the Middle East because of the association with the Iraq War and the previous Labour government, and exactly. For all those reasons. And so I think the criticism of Obama is fair, but equally was very isolated after that vote in Parliament, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, and I just think, that was a red light, a green light rather, for Assad, but it was also a signal to Putin, who also then thought, well, they don't mean anything, these people. And, a couple of years later, what did he do? Goes into Crimea, nothing happens. Yeah. So I think the global implications are enormous. And I think we need to be careful. And I don't think and even if we had a different president-elect in America, I don't think it is in the West's interest to go and intervene, because we've managed to spectacularly screw up most of the places we've got involved in. But we do need to support the Syrian people. And I think, if you look at the real joy on people's faces, we can only begin to imagine the horror of living under that brutal dictatorship.
Yeah, I think, as I said in the opening remarks there when we started talking about this, it's universally being welcomed that Assad has gone, at least in the West. Russia have given him asylum, Assad, so it's not going to make him any friends amongst the new regime in Syria, I wouldn't have thought. And it does also bear the question, doesn't it, as to how powerful Russia actually is, because they've now suffered a bloody nose there. People will say, well, they're distracted with Ukraine. Well, if they're this massive power, surely they can fight on more than one front. So it brings the same questions that Putin was able to argue against America when that Syrian situation happened in 2011? Well, people across the world, I guess, are going to be saying, Russia really as powerful as they're trying to make out, because this is a big, big blow to Putin, and may offer, as well as an opportunity for Syria now, an opportunity for a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. And Trump, again, is sort of trying to push them into that direction overnight with some of his remarks. I'm fascinated, Joe, the fact that Donald Trump, a renowned rule breaker, of course, but it's just assumed the presidency 2 months before he actually becomes president.
I know.
And it's been allowed to. There is no way that any other previous president-elect, including Trump 1, by the way, would have carried on like this. And I think, as much as it's a commentary on Trump, it's a commentary on Biden and how weakened he is. Because even Biden can't pick the phone up to Trump and say, what do you think you're doing, pal?
No, I know.
It's absolutely appalling.
Well, and, can you imagine at the reopening of Notre Dame and how beautiful and wonderful that was? Would a president-elect normally have been invited? No.
Scandal.
I mean, it is staggering. And Biden just looks like, dear old Uncle Joe sitting in the corner. And, he actually... It's a real shame, because he has had a very distinguished career in public service and in politics, but he is going to be remembered as the man who destroyed the Democrats, actually, and allowed Trump to get in. And I think, the fact that, as you say, Trump is making the headway, he's making these crazy appointments, he's putting all of these tech geeks in charge of all sorts of stuff. And as I have said before, Trump is Elon Musk's useful idiot, but people like Elon Musk can do an awful lot of damage and harm way before they fall out with Trump, which I'm sure will happen, because there's only room for one ego in that space. But it is staggering. And you look at the events in Paris over the weekend, which is bizarre, isn't it? You've got all the world's leaders there, including Zelensky and including Trump and Biden and Prince William and all the rest of it. Meanwhile, France is in chaos, total chaos. But everybody's going, oh, it is so beautiful. Look at it. It's a lovely cathedral. I mean, it is not. But, the Zelensky thing, are we now getting the sense that he does want to reach some sort of deal? Or has he realised that with Trump, there's going to be a lack of support? So actually, we need to get him on side to come to the deal.
Yeah, I think, and again, who knows with Trump? Who knows with Trump? The guy he's appointed as the ambassador to Ukraine, I think it's ambassador, it is actually very pro-Zelensky. So you just can't read the guy.
No.
You just can't read the guy. And his defense secretary, Rubio, is a far more serious politician than some of the other appointments he's making or he's attempting to make. So I just don't know about Donald Trump and foreign affairs. I think it depends what side of the bed he gets out of, the last person he's listened to. You just wouldn't know. But I think that the Syrian situation, complex though it is, and difficult for people in the UK to understand and appreciate those complexities, could be a far more important geopolitical activity than perhaps anything that we've seen this year, including Trump's election. We will see. We'll see how the cards fall. You've mentioned France. You've mentioned that wonderful reopening of Notre Dame. But of course, Macron continues to go from crisis to crisis. He called that election earlier than he needed to, and it's created a huge amount of chaos in Paris and in his country. And this week, Barnier, who'd been appointed as Prime Minister by Macron, he produced a budget, Joe, that instead of asking for 5% cuts so that France could begin to start to live within its means, 110% of its GDP debt, he went for 6%. and the hard right and the hard left combined to vote him out, vote no confidence. And Macron now is in search of another prime minister. He's saying he's going to stay on as president for another couple of years. I think it's going to be very difficult for them to remove him. And I just wonder again, Joe, whether or not people in France have just got this incredible notion that you don't have to pay for what you buy. You don't have to actually have a day of reckoning. You know, if the country is 110% of its GDP in debt, at some point they are going to have their Liz Truss moment. And Barnier was trying to save them from that. But the people in France don't want to listen.
No, exactly. And I think, you know, this is exactly what happened in Greece a few years ago. And Greece totally and utterly collapsed. And again, it was the rise of this sort of the relatively unknown, the young, the popular. We're going to make it different. It's going to be great. And all of a sudden, oh, actually, we can't afford to do all of this. You can't retire at 37 and live on a full state pension.
The bigger problem, though, Joe, of course, is that France and Germany are the big economies within the EU. So whereas Greece was a problem, of course, but the EU community could actually prop Greece up. Now, there was some pain for Greece to go through, of course, in terms of that bailout. But nevertheless, if France goes that way, then it doesn't just have implications for the people of France. It has implications for the whole of the European Union and potentially, for the whole of Europe and beyond. It's a big global player, is France.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that has got very little coverage, but I noticed in one of the papers over the last few days, is that France is the biggest exporter of energy. And this absolute stalemate they've got at the moment. I mean, there is only some consolation here. One is that Rachel Reeves can think, oh, my budget wasn't as bad as theirs. And Michel Barnier still managed to stay as Prime Minister longer than Liz Truss. So, there's a little bit of silver lining for two people at least. But, the implications, as you say, for industry, for commerce, for investment, for banking, for everything, is enormous. And France is such a vast country. And if you have France on the wobble and you've got Marine Le Pen, barking at the heels of Macron, even though she's potentially got a court case coming up in the spring, which could see her banned from public office for a number of years. And even if he appoints a new prime minister, which he'll have to, there's still no guarantee that they'll get the budget through, in which case, as you say, where is the grown-up attitude of, hang on a minute, you can't have something for nothing, which is what we're facing in this country. And it's sort of like everybody needs a quick box to the ears to say, grow up, people. You want to have this, well, you're going to have to give up this. You want a better health service, well, don't sit on the sofa filling your fat gut with pizza and drinking 18 pints a night. I'm not talking to you personally, Frank, obviously, but but with France on the wobble, and Germany also wobbling, and the collapse of particularly their car industry, this is very dangerous. And this is where you get the populists on the far right and the far left as well. It's not exclusively the right, but they tend to be in the ascendant at the moment. And I think we are living in a state of pre-conflict that is probably only matched by just before the Second World War. And I think it's because of the rise of people who will say, oh, we can fix it, you don't have to take any responsibility, and we're going to blame it on this group of people, whether they are gays, Jews, Muslims, immigrants, whatever. And that is the path that Europe is going down unless we're very careful. And I don't know how we stop it.
It is very frightening, actually, in terms of the comparisons you can make in the sort of late 20s, 30s, in the run-up to World War II. And I see the conflicts all over the world starting to emerge. Okay, we may be a little more hopeful that something positive will happen in Ukraine. We may be more hopeful for the future of Syria and the Middle East, at least at this moment in time. But it's a powder keg. And this idea that people now, and it is a Western problem, I think, just think you can have something for nothing, actually. And that credit boom that we all celebrated, and the fact that individuals went on splendid spending splurges with the credit cards, well, sadly, nation states have done that now, and the European Union is guilty as anyone else. And I read a fascinating piece in the Sunday Times yesterday where one of the commentators was saying this is akin to the fall of the Roman Empire. The European Union, Western society as we know it, has been such a dominant force for so many years, but actually it's all coming apart at the seams. And the main reason, not the only reason for that, of course, but the main reason being we're trying to live within, or beyond, our means. And people don't want to listen, do they? And that's why, when Keir Starmer stands up and tries to be the grown-up in the room, people are almost going, no, I don't want to listen to that. Let me just crack on and spend what you need to spend, and don't worry about the markets, and don't worry about how much debt the country's getting into.
But I wonder whether it is, I think, this is only my own personal view, but I do think it has got worse since COVID. Yeah. And I do think that there is a sense of, people, anyone who works dealing with the public will tell you that since COVID, people have become ruder, more aggressive, unpleasant, demanding, etc., etc. And I also think that, when we talk about climate change and the climate emergency, again, it's about the language that you use. If people feel helpless and powerless, then they think, oh, well, what is the point in worrying about it? And I think we have to be, we have to be wary that you can't be boosterish like Johnson, because we know that's a load of absolute bollocks. But at the same time, you have got to give people a reason to think actually things can get better, but you've got to make it different. And I would say that a little bit like maxing out on the credit card. Well, we're now facing the reality that we've got a wardrobe full of those lime green hot pants that were in a sale and too good to miss, still with the label on. And now it's time to do the garage sale and sell them to somebody else or give them to charity. And I think, if we all feel a bit miserable and a bit fed up, we actually have to look at the people in Syria and think, for a moment, they have hope.
Yes. And on that note, Joe, we will end this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. Back for our final one of the year next week, when Jim will be back joining us, and we will be looking back on 12 months of not insignificant political activity. So do join us for that last one next week. It's been great to have you, Joe. We'll catch you next week. Have a great 7 days, everyone, and thanks for listening.